The morning Lillian Talmadge rode into Caldwell, Kansas. She did so with her chin lifted and her eyes wide open, carrying nothing but a leather trunk, a sharp tongue, and absolutely no knowledge of the man who had nearly destroyed himself in that very town the year before. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat on the edge of the Chisholm Trail like a wound that had never quite healed over. The cattle drives pushed through it, churned the main street into a permanent river of dust and dung, and left behind saloons, gamblers, and the kind of men who had nowhere else to go. The town had a post office, a general store run by a man named Hobart Finch who weighed his thumb along with the goods, a church that doubled as a courthouse whenever Judge Alderman rode through, and a boarding house operated by a widow named Mrs. Clarence Prout, who rented rooms and opinions in equal measure. Lillian had come from Abilene. Her father had been a school teacher, her mother a woman who read every book she could lay hands on and pressed wildflowers between their pages. Both were gone now, the cholera having swept through their household in the winter of 1878, with the kind of indifference that the frontier showed to everyone eventually. Lillian was 23 years old, she had $52 sewn into the lining of her coat, and she had answered an advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle that read, "Schoolteacher needed. Caldwell, Kansas. Room and modest salary provided. Inquire with Mayor Gerald Hatch." She had not expected Caldwell to be beautiful, and it was not. But she had not expected it to feel like something either, and somehow it did. The wind came off the flat prairie with a warmth that surprised her, carrying the smell of buffalo grass and something distant and clean. She stepped down from the stage and looked at the row of wooden storefronts and felt, for the first time since her parents had died, something that resembled possibility. Mayor Gerald Hatch was a round man with excellent mustaches and the habit of speaking in declarations. He met her at the stage depot, confirmed her credentials with a single nod, and walked her down the main street pointing things out as though he were selling her the town. "Schoolhouse is at the East End," he said. 6 students currently. "Expect more once word gets around that we have a proper teacher. Previous one left in October. Didn't suit him." "What didn't suit him?" Lillian asked. "Caldwell," the mayor said, as though that were a complete answer. She was installed in Mrs. Prout's boarding house in a room on the 2nd floor that looked out over the main street. The window had a crack in it patched with newspaper, and the mattress was thin, but there was a writing desk and a hook for her coat and a view of the prairie that went on until the sky came down to meet it. She decided she could manage. It was Mrs. Prout who first mentioned Cyrus Keller, though she did not do it kindly. They were at breakfast the second morning, just the two of them, the other boarders having risen early for their various occupations. Mrs. Prout was pouring coffee and talking about the town with the proprietary authority of a woman who considered herself its unofficial historian. "You'll want to know who to avoid," Mrs. Prout said, settling herself across from Lillian with a cup in both hands. "Sheriff Amos Breck is a good man, fair as they come. Hobart Finch at the store cheats on weight, so you count everything yourself. The men at the Long Branch on Saturday nights are best left to their own affairs." And Lillian said, because the woman had clearly saved something for last. "And Cyrus Keller," Mrs. Prout said, lowering her voice though there was nobody else in the room. "He works out at the Dunmore Ranch about 4 miles east. Does their breaking and their fencing and whatever Dunmore needs done. Keeps to himself mostly. You'll see him in town on Fridays when he comes for supplies." "Should I be afraid of him?" Mrs. Prout considered this with a pursed expression. "No, not exactly afraid. He's not violent, not anymore. But he's broken, Miss Talmadge. Lost everything he had. Used to own land east of here. A small spread, tried to make something of it. Then there was the business with Fletcher Crane and the water rights, and after that his wife, well, she left. Took what little was left and went back to Missouri. And then he spent the better part of 6 months drinking himself half to death in the Long Branch. Sheriff had to drag him out more than once. The town took up a collection for him. She paused to sip her coffee. He didn't take it. Threw the money back at Reverend Hadley and said things I will not repeat at this table. But he's still here," Lillian said. "Still here," Mrs. Prout confirmed, with the tone of someone who had not yet decided whether that was commendable or simply unfortunate. Dunmore took him on out of Christian charity, some say. Others say Dunmore just wanted someone who wouldn't complain about the worst jobs. Either way, the town considers him finished. That's the only word for it. A man who had his chance and let it go to ruin. Lillian ate her biscuit and said nothing. She had come to Caldwell to teach children and rebuild her own life, not to concern herself with the tragic histories of men she had not met. She filed Cyrus Keller away in the back of her mind under the category of things that were none of her business and went to open the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse smelled of old chalk and wood smoke and was in need of sweeping, which she did herself with a broom she found leaning against the back wall. The 6 students who arrived that first morning ranged in age from 7 to 14, and they looked at her with the careful assessment of children who had learned not to get too attached to teachers. She introduced herself, wrote the date on the blackboard, April 14, 1879, and began. She met Cyrus Keller on a Friday, 11 days after her arrival, and not in the manner she might have predicted. She was at Finch's general store weighing out a pound of coffee beans herself, having taken Mrs. Prout's advice seriously, when the door opened and a man came in who made the whole room shift slightly, the way a room does when someone with weight to them enters it. Not physical weight, though he had that too. He was tall and broad through the shoulder, with hands that looked like they had been shaped by years of rope and iron and cold weather. He wore a canvas coat dusty from the trail, a battered hat the color of old tobacco, and a jaw that carried 3 or 4 days of dark beard. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with gray eyes that moved around the room the way a man's eyes do when he has learned to be careful. He came to the counter, set down a folded list, and said to Hobart Finch, "Dunmore's order." Finch took the list and went into the back. The man turned slightly, noticed Lillian at the scale, and gave her the kind of brief nod that was Caldwell's version of an introduction. She nodded back. Neither of them spoke. She was aware that he was watching her weigh the coffee beans out of the corner of his eye, and she was aware that something in his posture changed slightly, a faint loosening, as though he found it either amusing or interesting that she was checking the scale herself. "He's short on the weights," the man said quietly, as though commenting on the weather. "I know," Lillian said. "That's why I'm doing it myself." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something flicker in those gray eyes that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "You're the new school teacher," he said. "I am, Lillian Talmadge." "Cyrus Keller," he said, and he said his own name the way a man says something he is not entirely comfortable with in public but has accepted the necessity of. She had not yet been told the full story. She had been in Caldwell only 11 days, and while Mrs. Prout had given her the outline, she did not know his face or his voice or the specific quality of his silence, which was different from the silence of indifferent men. His silence had texture to it. It had weather inside it. "You work for Dunmore," she said. "I do." "Is it good work?" He considered this question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "It's honest work," he said, "which is mostly what matters." Finch came back with the first portion of the order, and Cyrus Keller turned back to the counter, and that was the end of their introduction. But she found herself thinking about the quality of his answer as she walked back to the boarding house. Not good work. Honest work. As though goodness were too much to ask for, but honesty was something he could still guarantee. She did not seek him out. But Caldwell was not large, and Fridays brought him to town reliably, and the next Friday she was leaving the post office when he was crossing the street, and he touched the brim of his hat to her, and she said good afternoon, and the Friday after that she was sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse grading papers when he passed on his way out of town and slowed his horse and said, "How are the students coming along?" "Slowly," she said honestly. "But I think they're starting to trust me." "That takes time out here," he said. "People don't trust quickly." "I've noticed," she said. "Are you one of those people?" It was a bolder question than she had intended, or perhaps she had intended it exactly as bold as it was. She met his eyes and did not look away. He held her gaze for a moment, and the afternoon light came at him sideways from the west, and she saw the lines at the corners of his eyes and the particular set of his mouth, which was that of a man who had trained himself not to say too many things. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I am." "Well," she said, returning to her papers, "that seems honest." He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and moved on, and she watched the line of his back as his horse carried him down the road toward the Dunmore ranch, and felt the strange, inconvenient sensation of wanting to know more about a person she had been told was finished. She went to Reverend Hadley's church that Sunday, as she had been doing since her arrival, partly out of habit, and partly because it was one of the few social structures the town offered that did not involve whiskey. She sat in the third pew and sang the hymns she knew and shook hands after the service and talked with some of the mothers whose children attended her school. It was one of these mothers, a woman named Clara Dawes, whose youngest son Thomas was in Lillian's class, who told her more about Cyrus Keller, not in the warning tone of Mrs. Prout, but in the reflective tone of someone who had watched something happen and still wasn't certain what to make of it. "He homesteaded east of here," Clara said, as they walked together through the churchyard in the pale morning sun. "He and his wife, Margaret. He came here in, 75 or 76. He was young, maybe 25. He had plans, real ones. You could see it when he talked about the land. He had this way of talking about what he was going to build that made you believe him." "What happened with Fletcher Crane?" Lillian asked, because it was the name Mrs. Prout had mentioned. Clara's expression tightened. "Crane owns the biggest spread west of town. He wanted Cyrus's water access. There's a creek that runs through the east property and it feeds Crane's cattle land to the north. Crane offered to buy it. Cyrus wouldn't sell. Crane found ways to make things difficult. Legal ways, mostly. Challenged the land claim, said there were irregularities in the filing, kept Cyrus tied up with lawyers and county officials for almost a year. The lawyers cost what little savings he had. The stress of it, I think it broke the marriage as much as anything." She paused. "Margaret left in the winter of 77. By spring of 78 he had lost the land through the legal proceedings, though everyone in town knew it was a manufactured case." "Was nothing done?" Lillian asked. "Was there no justice available to him?" Clara looked at her with the gentle sadness of someone explaining the rules of a game that Lillian had not yet learned. The county judge at the time had interests aligned with men like Crane. That's how it worked. The law was supposed to protect the homesteader, and sometimes it did. And sometimes it was used against him by men with more money and more influence. Cyrus didn't have either. She shook her head. "What happened to him afterward, the drinking, the bitterness, I never judged him for it the way some did. He came here and tried to build something honest, and the ground was pulled out from under him by a man who had no right to pull it. And now everyone thinks he's finished," Lillian said. "He's been working at Dunmore's for 6 months without a single incident," Clara said. "He's quiet, he keeps his word, and from what Henry Dunmore says, he works harder than 2 men. But the impression that was made, it sticks. The town saw him at his worst and decided that was all of him." She looked at Lillian sidelong. "Why the interest?" "Curiosity," Lillian said, and it was true, though it was becoming a more complicated kind of curiosity than she had started with. The thing that nobody seemed to credit, or perhaps nobody had been close enough to notice, was that Cyrus Keller was perceptive in a way that was rare. She discovered this gradually and without planning to. One Friday he came to town as usual, and she was on the schoolhouse steps again, because the afternoon light there was good for grading, and she had developed a fondness for the view of the street from that elevation, and he stopped his horse and said, "You've been here 2 months and nobody's invited you to Sunday dinner." She looked up from her papers. "That's a very specific observation." "I'm observant," he said, without arrogance, simply as fact. "Mrs. Prout feeds me adequately." "That's not the same thing," he said. "A boarding house meal isn't the same as sitting at someone's table." She set her papers on her knee. "Are you about to remedy this situation?" He seemed to weigh something in his mind, and she could see the weighing of it on his face. He was not a man who made casual offers. She understood that much about him. When he said something, he meant it, and he was being careful because he meant to say something. "I can't exactly invite you to Dunmore's," he said. "But I could bring a proper dinner somewhere if that's not too strange an offer." "It is a little strange," she said, "but I don't think that's a reason not to accept it." He looked at her steadily, and again there was that flicker adjacent to a smile. "Saturday evening," he said. "There's a spot by the creek east of town where the cottonwoods make good shade. It's decent country." "It sounds like you have particular feelings about that piece of land," she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "I do," he said. "I used to own it." She held his gaze. "Then I'd like to see it very much," she said. He nodded once and rode on, and she thought about what it meant that he was taking her to land he had lost, and she thought it meant he was testing something in himself, whether he could look at it still and not come apart. She decided she would help him with that test if she could, and she was not sure exactly when helping Cyrus Keller had become something she wanted to do, but it had, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. Saturday evening came warm and yellow, the prairie humming with the first insects of the season, the cottonwood trees along Willow Creek putting out their pale green leaves like a slow celebration. He was waiting for her at the east edge of town with 2 horses. She had mentioned to Clara Dawes that she could ride, and Clara had apparently mentioned it to him, a chain of small kindnesses she appreciated. He helped her mount with a steadiness that was practical rather than elaborate, and they rode out along the creek road without hurrying. He had packed the dinner in saddlebags. Bread he had made himself, which surprised her, cold roasted chicken from the Dunmore cookhouse, dried apricots, and a small jar of honey. He spread a blanket under the cottonwoods, and they sat with the creek moving past them in the late light, and she looked at the land around them, the grass going gold in the low sun, the blue sky deepening toward its evening color, and understood why a person would have fought for it. "Tell me about this place," she said. He looked at the land for a long moment. "I broke the first acre by hand in the spring of '76, he said. "The soil here by the creek is good, deep. There's clay underneath it, but not too much." He paused. "I planted corn the first year. It came up. Not everything does the first year, so that felt like a sign. And after the corn, winter wheat the following year. I was going to build a proper barn by the 3rd summer." He stopped. "None of that matters anymore. It matters that you did it," she said, "that you tried and built something real even if it was taken. That doesn't disappear." He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and undefended that was there only for a second before he looked back at the creek, but she had seen it. "You don't know the whole story," he said quietly. "I know enough of it," she said. "Clara Dawes told me about Fletcher Crane, and Mrs. Prout told me the other part, the part about the drinking and the long branch. I assume she told me that as a warning." He was very still. "And are you warned?" She tore a piece of bread and considered the question seriously. "The man who is sitting here with me, who made his own bread and packed a decent dinner and brought me to the land he used to love because he thought I should be invited somewhere properly," she said, "is not a man I need to be warned about." The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It had something trembling inside it. "The town thinks otherwise," he said. "The town saw you at your lowest point and decided that was your fixed state," she said. "I didn't come here with that story. I came here not knowing a single thing about Cyrus Keller, and what I've learned on my own is that you're perceptive and honest, and you work harder than any man in that town gets credit for, and you loved this land enough that losing it did damage to you, which tells me you were the kind of man who invested himself genuinely in what he was building." She looked at him directly. "A man like that is not finished. He's just temporarily stopped." He turned to look at her fully then, and she did not flinch from it. The evening light was on both their faces, and the creek talked quietly beside them, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a red-tailed hawk called once and was answered by nothing. "Where did you come from?" he said, not rhetorically but as a genuine question, as though she might be from somewhere he didn't have a name for. "Abilene," she said. "My parents died last winter. My father was a teacher and my mother was a reader, and between them they gave me a set of opinions about people that I have not yet found reason to revise." "What opinion have you formed about me?" he asked. "That you're worth knowing," she said simply. He picked up a small stone from the creek bank and turned it in his fingers without throwing it, just holding it, and she understood that he was doing something with his hands so that the rest of him could process what she had said. "I'm not easy," he said. "I need you to know that I'm not easy to be around sometimes. There are days that are harder than others." "I didn't think you were easy," she said. "Easy men don't interest me particularly." He set the stone down and looked at her, and the flicker in his eyes was not adjacent to a smile anymore. It was one, small and real and unexpected on his face, like the first green of spring through old ground. "You're a very unusual woman, Miss Talmadge," he said. "Lillian," she said. "If we're going to be friends, Cyrus, you should call me Lillian." "Lillian," he said, and the way he said her name was careful and deliberate, as though he was making room for it. The summer came to Caldwell the way summers always came to the Kansas plains, with a ferocity that left everything bleached and dry by July. The cattle drives came through, and the main street got louder and dirtier, and the saloons did more business, and the church did somewhat less. Lillian taught school through June, and then let the students go for the summer and spent her days on her own study, on correspondence with a former professor of hers in Abilene who sent her books, and on the slow, steady deepening of her friendship with Cyrus Keller. They took to meeting on Saturday evenings as a regular arrangement, sometimes at the creek, sometimes simply walking the edge of town where the prairie began, talking about everything and nothing in the manner of two people who have discovered in each other a companion for their thoughts. He talked about horses. He had a thorough knowledge of horses that bordered on devotion. And she talked about literature, and they argued gently about the meaning of things and agreed passionately about others. And she watched him emerge from himself the way she had watched the creekside cottonwoods put out their leaves, slowly, steadily, with increasing confidence that the season was real. He was not an easy man, as he had warned her, and she honored his warning by taking it seriously. There were Saturdays when he arrived quiet in a different way, a closed way, and she learned to give those silences room rather than filling them. She would simply sit beside him and let the evening do its work, and after a while he would start to talk and she would listen. He was not a man who wanted to be fixed. He was a man who wanted to be believed in, and she found that she believed in him without effort, which was its own kind of gift. He began to change in ways the town noticed before she did because she was too close to it. Mrs. Prout commented one morning that Cyrus Keller had tipped his hat to her in the street and said good morning with every appearance of meaning it. Clara Dawes reported that he had helped young Thomas build a birdhouse after school one afternoon without being asked. The sheriff, Amos Breck, stopped Lillian outside the post office one day in July and said, quietly and without ceremony, "Whatever you're doing with Keller, keep doing it." "I'm not doing anything," she said. "I'm just being his friend." "That's what I mean," Breck said. She was falling in love with him, and she knew it, and she was not afraid of it, which surprised her, because she had always been a woman who thought carefully before proceeding, and love was the kind of thing that could make careful thinking very difficult. But she felt no alarm. She felt, instead, an increasing certainty that was almost geological, deep and layered and formed by slow pressure over time. He had not said anything beyond friendship. He was careful that way, she understood, careful not to reach for things he wasn't certain he deserved. And she wanted to tell him that the question of deserving was more complicated than he made it, but she also understood that some things had to arrive at their own pace to mean anything, so she waited. The moment that changed things came in August, on a Thursday evening that was not one of their scheduled Saturdays. She had been walking back from Clara Dawes' house, where she had gone to drop off some arithmetic materials for Thomas, and the sky had been doing something extraordinary. The kind of prairie sunset that Lillian had decided was the West's attempt at apology for all its harshness. Every shade of orange and crimson and deep impossible pink blazed across the horizon in a display that made her stop in the middle of the road and stand still and simply look. Cyrus came along the road from the Dunmore direction, heading into town for something she didn't know about, and he saw her standing there looking at the sky, and he pulled his horse to a stop and looked at her looking at the sky, and she didn't notice him for a long moment because the sky was very compelling. When she did turn and see him, she felt her breath do something odd. He had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression that was wholly unguarded, the most open she had ever seen him, and it was the expression of a man who has just recognized something true. "You stopped for the sunset," he said. "It seemed rude not to," she said. He got down off his horse and came to stand beside her, and they both looked at the sky together, his horse nipping at the dry grass behind them. The colors deepened and shifted, and the prairie grass turned to copper in the last light. "Lillian," he said. "Yes, I think you should know something." The quality of his voice was different, careful in a new way, stripped of its usual defenses. "Tell me," she said. She did not look away from the sunset. "I have been trying to determine whether what I feel is something real or something manufactured by gratitude," he said. "I didn't want to speak until I was certain." "And?" she asked softly. "It's real," he said. "I've been in love with you since the evening at the creek when you said I was worth knowing. I think perhaps even before that. And I need you to understand that I am not the same as I was, but I am also not entirely rebuilt, and I don't know how to promise you certainty." She turned then to look at him, and his face in the last copper light of that August evening was the most honest thing she had ever seen. "I'm not asking for certainty," she said. "I'm asking for you. The actual you, not a promised version." "Lillian," he said again, and this time her name in his mouth was something different, full and significant. "Cyrus," she said, "I came to Caldwell without a single story about you. And everything I learned after, I learned myself. And what I learned is that I love you. That is my conclusion, and I'm confident in it." He reached out and took her hand, and his hand was large and warm, and she felt the calluses along his palm, and she thought there was no more honest evidence of a person's life than what their hands felt like. "I don't have much to offer you," he said. "Not right now. I have a job and a room at Dunmore's and a horse." "You have yourself," she said. "That's what I'm interested in." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest for a moment, and she could feel his heartbeat against her knuckles, steady and emphatic. "Will you let me court you properly?" he asked, with the intention of eventually asking a more important question if you'll allow me time to be in a position to ask it decently. It was the most formal sentence she had ever heard him speak, and it undid her completely, not because it was formal but because of what the formality cost him, how much care it represented. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Cyrus, with great pleasure." He did not kiss her then. He held her hand, and they watched the last of the sunset, and it was one of the finest evenings of Lillian Talmadge's life. The courtship was formal and genuine in the way that the period required, and real and complex in all the ways that periods cannot require or prevent. He came to see her on Sunday afternoons when his work at Dunmore's allowed, and he walked with her in the evenings, and he brought her things that were not expensive but were specifically chosen. A piece of ribbon in the precise blue-green of the creek in July, a book of botanical drawings he had found at the general store tucked under a pile of farming almanacs, a small jar of honey from a hive one of the Dunmore ranch hands kept, which he brought because she had put honey on the apricots that first evening and he had noticed. He noticed everything about her, which she found she could not resist. He noticed that she held her coffee cup with both hands in the morning, that she always read the final line of a letter before the beginning when she was anxious to know if the news was good, that she hummed while she graded papers without knowing she was doing it. He held all these observations with a tenderness that was quiet and private, not performative, not designed to impress her. She noticed everything about him too. The way he always checked a horse's feet before he mounted, the way he moved around other people's space with unusual consideration, The way he talked to his own horse in a low voice that she couldn't hear the words of but could hear the quality of, which was affectionate and slightly apologetic, as though he were explaining the inconvenience of the situation. She noticed that he had books at his room at Dunmore's, a small stack of them, and when she asked what he was reading, he showed her a history of the American West by a Boston scholar, and they argued about the accuracy of it for 2 hours with great pleasure. In September, Fletcher Crane came back into the story in a way that Lillian had not anticipated. She was at the general store when she heard his name spoken sharply by 2 men in conversation near the door, and she listened because she had learned that in Caldwell, information carried in passing conversation was often more accurate than anything official. Crane was apparently pushing again, this time against the small homesteaders to the south of his property. There were 3 family farms along the Southern Creek branch, and Crane wanted the water access, and he was using the same tactics he had used against Cyrus: legal challenges, delays, pressure. She told Cyrus about it that evening on their walk, watching his face carefully as she did. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been easy at his sides, closed briefly. "I know," he said. "Dunmore told me. One of the families affected is the Garvey family. I know them. Good people, came here from Ohio." "Is there anything to be done?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, and there was something in his voice that was different from the closed, defeated tone she had first known. There was something active in it. "There's a lawyer in Wichita who has been taking cases against the kind of claim manipulation Crane uses. His name is Aldrich Webb. Clara Dawes' husband mentioned him last spring, said Webb had won 2 cases in Douglas County against similar land grabs. Have you spoken to the Garveys?" "I'm going to," he said. "This week." She watched him make that decision in real time and felt the unmistakable quality of a person reclaiming something that had been taken from them. Not the land, not yet, but the sense of their own agency. He rode out to see the Garveys that week, and then he wrote a letter to Aldrich Webb in Wichita, and then he came back to town and spoke to Sheriff Breck about the particulars, and he did all of this with a focused, purposeful energy that was completely unlike the man the town thought it knew. Webb responded within a fortnight and agreed to represent the Garveys. It took until the following spring, but the Garvey claim was eventually upheld by the circuit court, the legal irregularities in Crane's challenge exposed by Webb's careful work, much of which was informed by Cyrus's detailed account of what had been done to his own claim years before. Fletcher Crane did not lose his ranch. He was too well established for that. But the judgment against him in the Garvey case was a matter of public record, and the county paper in Wichita ran a brief notice about it, and 2 other families who had been pressured by Crane came forward afterward with their own accounts. The shape of what he had been doing became visible, even if full justice remained partial. It was the kind of victory that the frontier offered most reliably, not complete, not clean, but real. Cyrus did not recover his own land through any of this. That was gone, and he knew it was gone, and he had accepted it with the clear-eyed acceptance of a man who has learned the difference between what can be changed and what cannot. But something in him had been restored by the fight, even at this remove. He had used what happened to him to protect someone else from the same, and that was its own form of justice. The town noticed. The town, which had written Cyrus Keller off as broken and finished, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition, began to revise its accounting. It happened slowly and without ceremony, the way opinion usually changes. A comment here, an acknowledgement there, Hobart Finch mentioning to his wife that Keller was a decent sort after all, Mrs. Prout revising her description from broken to recovered in her morning conversations, Sheriff Breck nodding to him in the street with a particular kind of nod that meant respect. Cyrus received all of this with a quietness that Lillian found remarkable. He did not have the vindicated man's urge to say, "I told you so." He simply let the town's new opinion settle around him like a change in weather, and kept doing his work, and kept coming to see Lillian on Sunday afternoons and Thursday evenings, with the steady reliability of a man who has decided that something is worth showing up for. He asked her to marry him on the first day of November, 1879, which was a Saturday, on their creek bank, with the cottonwoods bare and the grass winter pale and the creek running dark and cold, and the sky that particular shade of November blue that is about as clear and cold as things get on the Kansas prairie. He did not have a ring. He told her this with a directness that she appreciated. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I'm working toward one, but I thought if I waited until I had everything arranged it might take longer than either of us wants." "I don't need a ring," she said. "I know you don't," he said, "but you deserve one and I intend to provide it in due course." He paused. "Lillian, I would like to spend my life with you. I would like to build something again, and I would like to build it with you. I don't know what it will look like yet, but I know that whatever it is, it will be better because you're in it. Will you marry me?" She had known this question was coming, and she had still not prepared a measured response to it because she had decided measurement was not what the moment called for. "Yes," she said. "Cyrus, yes." He took both her hands and held them and looked at her for a long moment with that open, undefended expression she had come to know and love. And then he kissed her for the first time, on the cold November bank of the creek, with the bare cottonwoods overhead and the sound of the water beside them and the winter prairie stretching in every direction. And it was a good kiss, the kind that promises without elaborating, the kind that holds something careful and fierce in equal measure. They were married in March of 1880 in the Caldwell church by Reverend Hadley, who performed the ceremony with an expression of particular satisfaction, as though he had been expecting this outcome for some time and was glad to have been right. Mrs. Prout cried, which surprised everyone including Mrs. Prout. Clara Dawes' husband brought a bottle of good whiskey to the celebration afterward, and Cyrus had one glass of it and put the rest down without ceremony. And Lillian saw this and loved him all the more precisely because of it, because it was the act of a man who had measured himself and made a decision and stuck to it. Henry Dunmore, who was a plain-spoken man with large opinions and a generous heart that he concealed behind a weathered face, pulled Cyrus aside before the wedding and told him that if he wanted to stay on at the ranch, he was welcome to the small foreman's cottage on the east side of the property, which had been empty since the previous foreman had moved on to his own land in Colorado. It had 2 rooms and a good wood stove and a porch that looked out over the pasture, and it was the first real home Cyrus had had in 3 years. He carried Lillian over the threshold of that cottage the day after the wedding with the careful solemnity of a man performing a ceremony that matters, and she laughed and held onto his shoulders and looked at the small whitewashed rooms with their worn plank floors and the late winter light coming through the windows, and felt the specific happiness of beginning. They made that cottage a home with the industry of 2 people who understand the value of the thing they are building. Lillian hung dried sage and prairie flowers from the kitchen beams. Cyrus built shelves for her books, measuring each one 3 times before cutting the wood, which she found endlessly charming. She planted a kitchen garden in the narrow strip of soil along the south wall of the cottage. He trained a young roan mare that Dunmore had given him as a wedding gift, with the patient attention that she had come to recognize as his particular form of devotion. She went back to teaching in the fall, and the school had 8 students now, because word had indeed gotten around, as Mayor Hatch had predicted, that there was a proper teacher in Caldwell. One of the new students was a boy named Eli who was 12 and had never been to school at all, the son of a family that had come down from Nebraska, and he was behind the others in every subject but so clearly hungry to learn that Lillian stayed late with him twice a week. Cyrus picked her up on those evenings with the horse and trap and never complained about the extra weight, only asked how Eli was coming along. "He'll be reading at grade level by spring," she said confidently. "I believe you," Cyrus said, which was what he always said when she stated a goal, and the steady weight of his belief had become one of the most reliable things in her life. In the spring of 1881, their son was born. They named him James William Keller, after Lillian's father, whose name had been James, and Cyrus's grandfather, whose name had been William. He arrived in April, in the cottage, with Clara Dawes attending as the most experienced midwife in the area, and he was a loud, healthy boy with Cyrus's dark hair and Lillian's blue eyes, and a strong opinion about the world that he communicated at considerable volume. Cyrus held him for the first time with the same careful attention he brought to everything, his large hands absolutely sure, and looked at his son's face with an expression that Lillian would remember for the rest of her life. There was in that expression every hard year and every lost thing and every long empty morning, and there was over all of it, like light through water, something that was pure and undamaged and new. "Hello," Cyrus said to his son, very quietly. "You have no idea how glad I am that you're here." James, being 1 hour old and possessed of his own agenda, yelled back at him without restraint. The early years of their marriage were not without difficulty, because life in Caldwell in the early 1880s was not without difficulty, and they were honest with themselves about that. The winter of 1881 was hard, cold early and staying cold, and the cattle Dunmore had driven up from Texas that fall lost weight badly, and 3 died before spring. Cyrus worked double shifts through the worst of it and came home to the cottage hollow-eyed and cold-handed, and sometimes too tired to eat, and Lillian fed him and warmed him and made him sleep, and in the mornings she made coffee and sat with him in the early light, and let the silence be simply a silence between two people who trust each other, which is a very different thing from the silences of loneliness. There were also days that were harder for Cyrus in the internal sense, days when the old weight came back and settled on him, and she had learned to recognize them by a certain set of his shoulders and a particular look around his eyes that was the look of a man fighting something invisible. On those days, she did not try to talk him out of what he was feeling. She simply stayed close, went about the normal business of the household, and let him know without words that the ground was solid under their feet and she was not going anywhere. He always came back from those days. Each time he came back, he stayed gone a little less time than the last, as though the territory of the dark were slowly mapping its own limits. Fletcher Crane was still in the county, still running his operation, still a man with more power than was comfortable to have in one person's hands. But the Garvey judgment had changed the way other homesteaders organized themselves, and by 1882 there was a loosely formed association of small landholders in the county who shared information and pooled resources for legal challenges, and Cyrus was one of its founding members, which struck Lillian as perfect justice, the man who had been destroyed by the system becoming one of the people who worked to make the system function the way it was supposed to. He had a gift for it, it turned out. He could look at a legal situation and understand its vulnerabilities with the instinct of someone who had experienced those vulnerabilities from the inside. Aldrich Webb came down from Wichita twice that year to consult with the association, and the two men formed a working relationship that was mutually useful and became, over time, something closer to friendship. Cyrus Keller still worked for Henry Dunmore. He had become Dunmore's foreman properly by the spring of 1882, with a salary that was modest but real, and Dunmore valued him not only for his work with the horses and the ranch operations, but for his judgment, which was the slow, patient kind that came from paying attention. Dunmore was not a young man anymore, and he had no children, and there were conversations about the ranch's future that he initiated with Cyrus in the evenings on the porch of the main house, conversations that were abstract and hypothetical for now, but whose direction was clear enough. Lillian had understood by this point something about her husband that she thought many people in Caldwell were still catching up to. He was not simply recovered. He was not the man he had been before his losses, because that man was gone and could not be retrieved. But what had grown in his place was something more complex and more durable, with the kind of depth that comes only from having been reduced to nothing, and having to find out what was actually essential. He was a better man than the young homesteader with his corn and his plans and his naive certainty. He was a man who had learned what he was made of under the worst conditions, and what he was made of was something she was proud to be beside. In 1882, she told him she was expecting their second child, and he sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands in a gesture that was not distress but its opposite, the gesture of a man confronting more happiness than he had expected to be allowed. "Are you all right?" she asked, laughing a little. He lifted his face, and his eyes were bright, and his voice, when he spoke, was unsteady in the best way. "I am extraordinarily all right," he said. "Come here." She went to him, and he pulled her close and held her there by the kitchen stove, with James playing on the floor with a wooden horse that Cyrus had carved for him. And the afternoon sun came through the window and lay across the worn planks, and everything was so particularly good that she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed it in. Their daughter was born in January of 1883. They named her Ruth Clara Keller, the Clara for Clara Dawes, who had brought both children into the world with steady hands and an encouraging manner. Ruth was quieter than James had been at birth, more observational, arriving with an expression of focused attention that Cyrus said looked like she was already taking inventory of the situation. "She got that from you," Lillian told him. "I choose to take that as a compliment," he said. "It is one," she said. Caldwell changed in those years as frontier towns changed. The cattle drives began to diminish as the railroad extended further north and the open range was replaced by fenced land. The wildness of the town, the Saturday night chaos that had defined the Long Branch and the main street in the late 1870s, settled into something more domestic. New families came. A second church was built. A doctor arrived in 1882, a young man from Philadelphia named Dr. Samuel Eaton, who was as out of his element as Lillian had been in her first days, and who she took it upon herself to introduce around because she remembered that strangeness. Mayor Hatch ran for his fourth term in 1882 and won without serious opposition. He continued to point out the town's assets to anyone who would listen. The schoolhouse was expanded with a second room which brought the student count to 14, which required Lillian to consider taking on an assistant teacher, a responsibility she took up with Thomas Dawes, who was now 16 and showed an aptitude for instruction that delighted her. Mrs. Prout, who had lived to see her original assessment of Cyrus Keller revised so thoroughly that she had reinvented herself as one of his champions, died quietly in the winter of 1883, in her sleep, at what she had estimated was 72 years of age. Lillian attended the small service and felt the loss of her genuinely, because the woman had been the first person to give her a picture of Caldwell, and she had done it with more honesty than she perhaps knew, and it turned out that knowing the full worst of a person before you know them is not always a warning. Sometimes it is a map. In 1884, Henry Dunmore died. He had been failing since the fall before, a slow diminishment that the doctor from Philadelphia called a weakness of the heart, and he had faced it with the same weathered practicality with which he had faced everything else in 30 years of cattle ranching. He had arranged his affairs carefully and without drama. The ranch was left, in its entirety, to Cyrus Keller. When the will was read in the front room of the ranch house, by the lawyer who came from Wichita for the purpose, Cyrus sat very still and said nothing for a long time. Lillian was beside him. She felt him take a breath that was slow and full and entirely steady, the breath of a man who is accepting something enormous without letting it overturn him. "He shouldn't have done this," Cyrus said quietly. "He had a brother in Missouri." "He had a falling out with his brother in Missouri 30 years ago," the lawyer said. "He was very clear on that point. The ranch goes to you. He wrote a letter. He handed it across the table." Cyrus read the letter privately, in the barn, which was his habit with things that mattered deeply, and Lillian did not ask what it said. Later that evening, when the children were asleep and they were sitting by the stove with their coffee, he said, He wrote that a man who works his land as though it were his own deserves to have it be his own, and that I had earned it 3 times over. He paused, and he said that watching me with you and the children was the most useful proof he'd ever found that people can mend. She reached across and put her hand over his. He was right, she said. He trusted me with something enormous, Cyrus said. The least I can do is make it worth what he believed. You will, she said. He looked at her. I know, he said, and it was not arrogance. It was simply a man who had learned, finally, to trust his own word. The Dunmore Ranch became the Keller Ranch in the spring of 1884, under the official recording in the county land register, and Cyrus ran it with a seriousness and a competence that drew notice from neighboring ranchers and from the county itself. He kept a smaller operation than Dunmore had run at peak, focused on horses as much as cattle, because horses were what he knew most deeply and most specifically, and he had a reputation for producing animals that were well-trained and honest in their work. He hired 2 ranch hands and paid them fairly, which was not universal practice, and created a working environment that retained its people, which also was not universal. One of his hands was a Mexican man named Rodrigo Vilas who had come north from Texas, and who Cyrus hired over the objections of 2 Caldwell men who expressed objections that were not about qualifications. Cyrus heard those objections, did not acknowledge them as legitimate, and hired Rodrigo, who turned out to be the best horseman on the property after Cyrus himself. The injustice of the frontier was woven into everything, and Lillian and Cyrus both understood it even when they could not fully fix it. They could see it in the treatment of the homesteaders who were not white and who had fewer legal protections. They could see it in the way the law applied differently depending on who you were. They could not single-handedly change the structure of the world in which they lived, but they could choose, specifically and repeatedly, to operate within it with fairness, and they did. James turned 4 in April of 1885 and began to follow Cyrus around the ranch with the worshipful persistence of a small boy who has decided his father is the most interesting person in his world, which Cyrus accepted with a mixture of amusement and a visible awareness that he was being watched and needed to be worthy of it. He taught James to approach a horse properly before the boy could spell his own last name, which Lillian called getting priorities confused, and Cyrus called getting them exactly right. Ruth at 2 was already showing the particular focused quality that had been apparent at her birth. She would sit on the kitchen floor with a pile of objects and arrange and rearrange them with a seriousness that was remarkable in a person of her size. Lillian watched this and thought about her own mother pressing wildflowers into books, and felt the sweet and complicated emotion of watching traits pass through generations. In the summer of 1885, Aldrich Webb came down from Wichita with his wife and spent a weekend at the ranch. The first time Lillian had met him in person, and she found him to be a sharp-minded man with a dry humor and a deep commitment to the idea that the law was supposed to mean what it said. They had dinner on the porch in the warm evening and talked about the changes coming to Kansas and what the end of the open range would mean for small landholders and how the legal framework needed to keep pace with the practical reality. The good news, Webb said, refilling his glass from the pitcher of water on the table, is that there are more and more men in the county legal system who actually believe in what it's supposed to do. And Fletcher Crane? Cyrus asked. Crane is old, Webb said simply. His son is a different sort, quieter, less aggressive. He paused. I don't expect further trouble from that direction. Cyrus nodded once and looked out at the pasture, where the last of the evening light lay across the grass in long golden bars. He had lived in this county long enough to know that some things did not fully resolve, and that the only answer to that was to keep building your own life clearly and well, and let the passing of time do what time does. Lillian watched him across the dinner table and felt the fullness of everything they had accumulated together, not in the material sense, though the ranch was real, and the cottage had expanded by 2 rooms and the horses in the pasture were theirs, but in the sense of history and trust, and all the small, specific moments of knowing each other that stack up over years into something that cannot be taken away. She thought about the afternoon she had arrived in Caldwell on the stage with $52 in her coat lining, and no stories about anyone, and about how the absence of a particular story had turned out to be the most important thing she had not known. She had not come here knowing that the town had given up on Cyrus Keller. She had not arrived with the picture of him at his worst drawn before she had seen him at any other angle. She had met a man at a scale in a general store who noted quietly that the storekeeper cheated on his weights, and she had formed her opinion of him from the inside out rather than the outside in, and everything that had followed was a consequence of that clean beginning. She told him this once, late at night, after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and the autumn stars were doing their extravagant business overhead. "Do you know what I think the most important thing was?" she said. "Tell me," he said. He was lying on his back looking at the sky, which was their habit on clear nights, the two of them on the porch with a blanket against the chill. "I arrived here without any version of you already in my head," she said. "Mrs. Prout gave me a warning, but it was too soon. I hadn't met you yet, so it didn't take. I just came to the store and met a man at a scale and decided for myself." "Is that unusual?" he asked. "Meeting someone without preconceptions?" "In a small town, yes," she said. "In Caldwell, everyone knows everyone's history before they know the person. The history becomes the person. And without the history I saw you," she said. "Just you, and you were worth seeing." He was quiet for a moment with the stars overhead and the prairie wind moving through the grass beyond the porch. "You gave me my own life back," he said finally. "I want you to know I understand that, not in the sense that you fixed something that was broken, because that's not what happened. You were just there, being exactly who you are, and it became something I wanted to be worthy of. You can't know what that does for a person." "I think I can," she said. "It's what you do for me every day." He found her hand in the dark and held it. The years moved through them with the particular quality that good years have, full enough to feel rich but fast enough in retrospect to seem like moments. James grew into a boy who was half Cyrus's patience and half Lillian's precision, a combination that manifested as a quiet, thorough manner of approaching everything, whether it was a mathematical problem or a balky horse. Ruth remained her particular, organized self, and added to her array of focused interests an attachment to the school that began with following her mother there on occasional mornings and became, by the time she was 5, a daily presence, so much that Lillian kept a small chair for her at the back of the room. In 1887, Lillian found she was expecting a third child, and she told Cyrus over breakfast on a weekday morning, with James at the table eating his oatmeal and Ruth drawing something careful on a piece of paper, the most ordinary possible backdrop for an announcement. Cyrus set his coffee cup down and looked at her, and his face did what it always did with the best news. It opened completely. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. James looked up from his oatmeal. "Another baby," he said with the politely concealed ambivalence of a 6-year-old. "Yes," his father told him. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" James asked. "We won't know until it arrives," Lillian said. James considered this. "I'd like a brother," he said. "Ruth doesn't care about horses the same way." Ruth looked up from her drawing. "I care about horses," she said with dignity. "I care about all of them. I just don't want to ride them." Cyrus laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that was one of Lillian's most beloved sounds in the world, and the morning in the kitchen with its smells of coffee and wood smoke and oatmeal went on around them all. Their second son, Henry William Keller, was born in the early spring of 1888. Henry, for Henry Dunmore. William, for the grandfather's name they had already given James as his middle name, and which seemed right to carry forward for its own reasons. He was a broad-shouldered, red-faced baby with strong opinions about comfort and an attachment to his father that began approximately at the moment Cyrus first held him and lasted, as far as any of them could see, indefinitely. Caldwell had grown. The wildness of the trail town had largely domesticated itself by the late 1880s. The rowdier elements moved on or moved indoors. The social structure of the permanent community asserting itself with churches and schools and civic organizations, and the general project of making a place where people could live their whole lives. It was no longer the frontier in quite the same sense, though the sky still went on forever and the winters still came hard and the prairie was still, on its own terms, a vast and demanding country. The Keller Ranch was part of that settled community now, one of its anchors. Cyrus was a man the county knew and respected, his name associated with good horses and reliable fencing and fair dealing, and for those who paid attention, the quiet work of the Landholders Association that continued to function as a watchdog for the kind of legal manipulation that had taken his own land a decade before. He was also known, by those who had been in Caldwell long enough, as the man who had come back from nothing to build something better than what he'd lost. And this story was told differently now than Mrs. Prout had told it, with the full arc of it visible rather than just the lowest point. Lillian ran the Caldwell School through 1888, at which point she reluctantly handed off the primary role to a new teacher from Lawrence whose name was Abigail Moore, and who was 22 and capable and kind, exactly the kind of successor she would have designed if she'd had the choosing of her. Lillian stayed involved as a supplementary teacher and the school board's most active member, which was not retirement from education, but a different form of it. She had found that her ideas about what children needed to learn had expanded past arithmetic and penmanship and into questions of history and reasoning, and the examination of what the world told people was true versus what was actually true. And she brought those ideas to the board meetings with the same directness she had brought to everything since arriving in Caldwell. In 1889, when James was 8 and old enough to be trusted with a horse on the ranch property unsupervised, Cyrus spent a Sunday afternoon watching his son ride the young bay gelding that had been assigned to him for exactly this purpose, and Lillian watched Cyrus watch James, and what she saw on her husband's face was the specific pleasure of seeing something carried forward. "He's good," she said. "He's very good," Cyrus said, with a pride that was not the boastful kind but the observational kind, the kind that simply reports the truth. "He has your hands," she said, "the way he holds the reins." "He holds them better than I did at that age," Cyrus said. "You're a better teacher than your teacher was," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "What makes you think my teacher wasn't excellent?" "Because you improved on what you were given," she said. "That usually means you were working from a limited foundation and improved it through your own observation." He shook his head, and the smile was in his eyes and his voice when he said, "I find you to be the most comprehensively observant person I have ever met." "That's how I knew to marry you," she said. "Is it?" He said, reaching over and taking her hand where they stood by the fence. "Partly," she said. "The sunset also helped, and the honey." "The honey," he repeated. "You remembered I liked honey on the apricots," she said. "You brought the jar specifically for that, I noticed." "I notice things about you," he said simply. "I know," she said. "That's the other reason." James came around the far end of the paddock on the bay gelding with a form that was genuinely quite good for an 8-year-old, and Cyrus raised his voice to offer a correction on his position in the saddle, and James made the correction without argument, and Ruth appeared at Lillian's elbow asking about something she had read, and Henry toddled after her in his determined way, and the October afternoon held all of them in its ordinary light. The spring of 1890 brought a development that none of them had expected. Clara Dawes came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, which was unusual enough that Lillian came out to meet her in the yard with a sense of something significant approaching. Clara had the look of a woman with news she is both eager and nervous to deliver. "I've had a letter from Aldrich Webb," Clara said, before she had even dismounted. "He's been in contact with the State Land Office in Topeka." "About the Keller claim from '78, Lillian stood very still. "What about it?" The case that was used to dispossess Cyrus was formally reviewed as part of a statewide audit of land claims from the territorial period, Clara said. There were several claims identified where the original proceedings were found to have been conducted with Webb's exact word was irregularities sufficient to constitute fraud. Cyrus's claim was on the list. Lillian's heart was doing something complicated. What does that mean in practice? It means, Clara said carefully, that there may be a path to some form of restitution. Not the land itself. The land has changed hands twice since then, and those claims are established. But monetary compensation from the county for the fraudulent dispossession. Cyrus was at the barn and came out when he heard the horses, wiping his hands on a cloth, and Lillian watched his face as Clara told him what she had told her. He listened without interrupting, which was his way with important information, and his face was still and careful while he processed it. When Clara finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Webb is certain of this," he said. "He's filed the paperwork with the state land office on your behalf," Clara said. "With your permission, obviously. He wanted to write you himself, but he was in court in Wichita this week and asked me to bring the news directly so it wouldn't wait for the post." "He filed it already," Cyrus said. "He said he didn't want to give you the opportunity to tell him not to," Clara said with a small smile. Cyrus looked at Lillian. She met his eyes and held them. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I spent a long time being angry about what was done. And then I spent time letting go of the anger because it was doing me more harm than Crane was. And now," he paused, "now I think the anger was right. Not the way I expressed it, not the drinking and the bitterness. But the underlying anger was right, because what was done was wrong, and it's right that it should be named as wrong." "Yes," she said, "it is." "Tell Webb to proceed," Cyrus said. The process through the state land office took the better part of a year, as these processes do, with letters back and forth between Webb and Topeka, and occasional requests for documentation that Cyrus provided with meticulous care. The final determination came in the winter of 1891, and it confirmed what Webb had argued. The proceedings against the original Keller homestead claim had been conducted through manufactured legal irregularities that constituted fraudulent dispossession. The monetary award was modest. It did not represent the full value of what the land had been or what could have been built on it. Cyrus received it without ceremony, put the paper in the desk drawer in the ranch house where he kept important documents, and told Lillian about it over dinner while the children ate and the stove made its comfortable sounds. "Is it enough?" she asked. "It's not about the money," he said. "It was never about the money." "Then what is it?" "The record," he said. "It's on the record now. What happened? What was done? That's what matters. The truth of it is written down somewhere permanent." She understood that completely. The truth of it written down somewhere permanent. For a man who had been told by circumstances and by a town's collective opinion that he was a failure and a cautionary tale, having the record acknowledge that he had been wronged rather than wrong was its own form of restoration. He donated half the award to the Landholders Association's legal fund. The other half he put toward expanding the ranch's water system, which was a practical necessity he had been putting off, and which now he addressed with the focused satisfaction of a man investing in the future of something he owns. James turned 10 in 1891 and had developed into exactly the kind of boy his parents were, curious and thorough and unexpectedly funny when his humor surfaced, which it did in dry observations that caught people off guard. He was helping with the ranch horses in earnest now, not as a treat, but as a genuine part of the operation, and Cyrus trusted him with the young animals' early handling in a way that was both practical and deeply intentional. Ruth at 8 was reading at a level that impressed even Lillian, who was not easy to impress about reading. She had developed a particular interest in botany that had begun with Lillian's kitchen garden and expanded into systematic observation of the prairie plant life around the ranch, conducted in a small notebook she carried in her apron pocket and filled with careful pressed specimens and her own dense, precise notes. Lillian had ordered her a book on plains botany from a publisher in Chicago, and the arrival of that package was treated by Ruth with more ceremony than Christmas. Henry, at 3, was the most purely joyful person in the household, his father's intensity converted into something lighter by some alchemy of temperament, and he moved through the world at an angle of approximately 30 degrees of permanent enthusiasm. He was also, at 3, firmly convinced that the barn cat named Oat, a large orange animal of advanced age and strong personal opinions, was his best friend, which Oat tolerated with magnificent patience. In 1892, Lillian stood at the window of the ranch house kitchen one morning in February, a cup of coffee in both hands in the habit she had never lost, looking out at the yard where Cyrus was crossing from the barn in the early light, his breath clouding in the cold air, his step unhurried and certain. He had the look of a man who is exactly where he belongs, the look of a person whose geography and interior life have reached some agreement. She felt the warmth of the coffee cup against her palms and the warmth of what she was looking at, which was her life, actual and present and ongoing. He came through the door and stamped the cold off his boots and looked up and saw her standing there watching him and smiled. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." "Just looking," he repeated, crossing to her and bending to kiss her in the easy, domestic manner of people who have kissed in the same kitchen for 12 years and have not yet found the habit anything less than good. "Sit down," she said. "I made eggs." He sat down and she brought the eggs, and the coffee, and James appeared from upstairs, tousle-headed and serious, and Ruth came behind him already awake and precise, and Henry came last at full speed, and the kitchen filled up with the noise and warmth of a morning that was ordinary in the very best sense. Ordinary, in the sense of being the thing that ordinary can be when it is built right. In the summer of 1893, Sheriff Amos Breck retired, having served the town for more than a decade with the same steady fairness he had shown when he told Lillian to keep doing whatever she was doing with Cyrus Keller. The town threw him a dinner at the church, which doubled as a celebration and a thank you, and both Cyrus and Lillian were there with the children, and Breck, who was not a sentimental man by any accounting, made a short speech about Caldwell and what it had been and what it had become, and in the middle of it he looked at Cyrus and said, "Some of the best work this town ever did was believing in people who had stopped believing in themselves. I'm proud of that." Cyrus met his eyes and nodded once, and that was a whole conversation. The 1890s brought changes to Caldwell and to the surrounding county that none of them had seen in quite that form before. The frontier, as it had existed in the wild sense of the word, was formally closing. The census of 1890 had noted the disappearance of a continuous frontier line in the country's settlement maps, which was an abstract observation that corresponded to concrete changes on the ground. The trail drives were largely done. The open range had given way to fenced land and settled communities. The wildness that had made Caldwell what it was when Lillian had arrived in 1879 was a memory, a story told in the evenings, a thing the older residents described to the younger ones with a mixture of pride and relief. What remained was something both simpler and more real, a community of people who had chosen to be there and who were making something of it. Cyrus was a part of that community in a way that was woven into its fabric, his name on the Landholders Association, his horses in the county, his wife at the school board, his children in the school and on the ranch, his history in the town's memory in its full form now, not just the chapter the town had once thought was the whole story. In 1894, James at 13 began to talk about what he wanted to do with his life in the concrete way that 13-year-olds occasionally surprise you with, and what he said was that he wanted the ranch, specifically the horses, specifically the breeding and training operation that his father had built. He said it matter-of-factly at dinner one evening, as though it were something he had determined some time ago and was only now reporting. Cyrus looked at him across the table. "That's a hard life," he said. "I know," James said. You'd be better off with some formal schooling first. Your mother's professor friend in Abilene mentioned the Kansas State Agricultural College. They have a good animal husbandry program. James looked at Lillian. Is that what you want for me? I want what you want pursued as fully as possible, she said. Your father's suggestion about the college is good. James thought about this with his characteristic thoroughness. All right, he said. I'll go to the college, and then I'll come back and we'll make this operation twice what it is. Cyrus's expression was the one Lillian loved most on him, the one that was almost a smile and was also something deeper than that. All right, he said. That's a plan I can agree to. Ruth, at 11, listened to all of this and then said, I want to study plants, which was not a surprise to anyone in the room. You can study plants, Lillian said. Properly, Ruth said, with a proper scientific education. We will arrange it, Lillian said firmly. When the time comes, we will arrange it. Henry, at 6, announced that he wanted to be the person who fed oat, a declaration that was in no way connected to the larger conversation, but that was received with appropriate gravity. The seasons moved. The ranch grew, slowly and deliberately, in the way that things built on good judgment grow, not spectacularly but sustainably, each year adding to the foundation of the last. Cyrus and Lillian marked the years in the way people do who are paying attention to them. In the height of their children, in the new fence line completed, and the new foaling season, in the books read and the conversations had, and the particular angle of light in October afternoons. They had the argument that all couples have in some form, about money and priorities, and how much risk was reasonable, and how much caution was too much. And they had it honestly, and they resolved it and moved on. They had the harder conversation, once, about the years before she had come, when he told her more than he had told her before about the worst of what those months had been, and she listened without flinching and without trying to minimize it, and held it with him, and that was one of the most intimate things they had ever done. He still had the days that were harder. They became less frequent over the years, but they did not disappear entirely, and she had made her peace with that long ago. What she had learned, and what she told Clara Dawes once when they were talking in the way old friends talk, was that the darkness in a person was not the opposite of their goodness, but sometimes the evidence of how much they had felt and how hard they had tried. The depth of a wound tells you something about how much was there to be wounded. You never gave up on him, Clara said. I never had to, Lillian said. I came in without anyone's warning. I just saw what was there. In 1897, James Keller left for the Kansas State Agricultural College at Manhattan, Kansas, which he did in the company of Cyrus and Lillian, who drove him as far as the Wichita train station, and put him on the eastbound train with his trunk and his seriousness, and his particular kind of contained excitement. Cyrus shook his hand on the platform, which James bore with the straight-backed dignity of a young man of 16, who is working hard not to show how much this moment means to him. And then Cyrus embraced him quickly and hard, and said something quietly into his ear that Lillian did not hear, but that made James's expression do something young and unguarded before he collected himself and boarded the train. What did you tell him? She asked on the drive back. That he is the best thing I have ever helped build, Cyrus said, and that I'm proud of who he is and not just what he'll do. She put her hand on his arm and left it there the rest of the drive. Ruth, at 14, was spending her afternoons with a correspondence course in botany, arranged through the University Extension program in Lawrence, a thing that Lillian had pursued with considerable persistence until she had found it and made it happen. Ruth conducted it with the same focused seriousness she had always brought to her notebook, and her letters to the university instructor in Lawrence were so precise and well-reasoned that the instructor had written to Lillian to ask if the student was actually 14 or if there was an error in the records. Henry, at 9, was his own category. He had his father's strength and his mother's warmth and some combination of both that produced a person who was fundamentally cheerful about the existence of things, who treated every new day as an interesting development. and who had expanded his friendship with Oat the barn cat into a general policy of befriending animals that the ranch hands found extremely entertaining and occasionally useful when a difficult animal needed to be settled. In 1899, at the turn of a century that the newspapers were calling historic, and the people of Caldwell were approaching with the practical concern for whether the winter was going to be hard, Lillian Keller stood on the porch of the ranch house she and Cyrus had made their home for 15 years and looked out at the yard and the pasture and the far edge of the property, where the grass met the sky in the particular clean line that the Kansas plains made. And she thought about the woman who had ridden into Caldwell on a spring day in 1879 with $52 and no stories. She was 43 now, and Cyrus was 48, and they had been married 19 years, and their children were growing into their own lives with the independence that was both the point of raising them well and the bittersweet evidence that the raising was working. James would be back from the college in the spring, and they had begun talking, the three of them, about how to expand the breeding operation and what the next 20 years of the ranch might look like. Ruth had received an acceptance letter from the Kansas State Normal School, where she intended to study natural sciences, and Lillian had read it and felt the specific pride of watching her daughter reach for something that mattered to her. Henry at 14 was still Henry, earnest and warm, and now very good with the young horses in the way that people who are fundamentally kind often are. And he had told his father with all the solemn intention of a 14-year-old that he intended to be a part of whatever James and the ranch built, which Cyrus had said sounded like exactly the right plan. Cyrus came out onto the porch and stood beside her, and she didn't need to look at him because she knew exactly how he stood, the particular line of his shoulder, the way he settled when he was at ease. "What are you thinking about?" he said. 19 years, she said. "Is that a good thought?" She turned to look at him then. This man who had been the man the town had given up on, who had been finished and broken and past redemption in the accounting of people who thought they knew the whole story, who had been none of those things in truth, but only a person whose worst moment had been witnessed and whose best were still to come. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her since the beginning, with that quality of seeing her completely and finding what he saw to be worth looking at, and it had not diminished in 19 years but had deepened in the way that water deepens when the land continues to receive it. "It's the best thought I have," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked out at the land together, the land that was theirs, built back from nothing, built from a man's decision to keep going and a woman's decision to see who he actually was rather than who she had been told he was. "James will be home in April," he said. "I know. And Ruth leaves for Manhattan in September. I know that too. And Henry told me this morning that Oat had kittens." She laughed, the sound of it warm and full in the cold morning air. "Oat is a female cat. Apparently," Cyrus said, "we have been wrong about Oat for 9 years. Henry must be delighted." "Henry has named all 4 of them," he confirmed. She laughed again and felt his arm tighten around her shoulder, and the morning stretched out before them with its cold, clear light and its wide open distance and its particular promise. And Lillian Keller, who had come to Caldwell without a single story about the man beside her and had made a whole life's worth of her own, was exactly where she intended to be. James returned from the agricultural college in the spring of 1900, 20 years old and taller, and with the same thoroughness about him, but with new vocabulary and new ideas, and an energy about the horse breeding operation that had Cyrus spending long evenings with him at the kitchen table, going over plans and prospects with the focused pleasure of 2 people who love the same work. They expanded the breeding operation that summer, adding a proper stallion barn on the east side of the property, and Cyrus gave James the operational lead on the new program, while keeping his own deep involvement as the experienced foundation of it. It was a good partnership, the kind that is genuinely equal in its different ways, and watching them work together was one of Lillian's particular pleasures. Ruth left for the normal school in September as planned, and the morning she rode away from the ranch in the family trap with Henry driving her to the stage depot, because James was needed with the horses and Cyrus and Lillian came together in the yard to see her off. There was the fullness of a moment that held the whole project of their life together in miniature. Their daughter, composed and bright-eyed and carrying her botany notebook in her bag alongside her formal course materials, looked at them both from the seat of the trap with an expression that was love and gratitude and the particular tenderness of a young person who can see, clearly and specifically, what she has been given. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of it." Cyrus put his hand on her knee for a moment in the brief, certain gesture he used for the things that mattered most. "Go learn everything," he said. Henry clicked to the horse and the trap moved off down the ranch road, and Cyrus and Lillian stood in the yard and watched it go, and the September morning was warm and the grass was beginning to go bronze and the sky was that deep impossible blue and everything was as it should be. He put his hand in hers. "We did good work," he said. "We did," she agreed. "I mean with all of it," he said. "The ranch, the children, all of it." She looked up at him. "I know what you mean," she said. "And yes, we did." The years that followed carried them deeper into the century they had not been born into, but had decided to belong to. The new century had its changes, as centuries do, and the Kansas plains received them in the way the plains received everything, with a certain immovability that acknowledged the wind and kept its own course. Caldwell was a different town than the one Lillian had ridden into, domestic and established and settled, and both better and lesser for the settlement in different ways, but real, the way places become real when people have lived their whole lives in them. James married in 1903, a woman named Clara, a different Clara, though the coincidence made the elder Clara Dawes laugh when she heard it, who was from a farming family to the north, and who had the good sense and good humor that the Keller household selected for naturally. They built their own house on the east portion of the ranch property, and the business expanded with a natural partner added to it, and James and his Clara became themselves a unit, which Lillian observed with the clear-eyed pleasure of a woman who has lived long enough to see the second generation begin its own story. Henry, at 20, in 1907, made it known that he was interested in a young woman from the Vilas family, Rodrigo's youngest daughter, Marisol, who was 19 and had grown up around the ranch and shared Henry's fundamental cheerfulness about the world and his love for animals. There were those in the county who expressed opinions about this, because the world had not yet done the work it needed to do about the assumptions it carried. Cyrus heard those opinions with the same quietness with which he had heard the objections when he had hired Rodrigo, and then he shook Henry's hand and went a call on Rodrigo Vilas and sat with him on his porch and said, in the direct way of a man who has decided, "Your daughter would be a good match for my son, and I'd be honored by it." Rodrigo looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once slowly. "Marisol makes her own decisions," he said, "but I think she's already made this one." The wedding was in the spring of 1908, and it was an occasion the community attended in its various attitudes, and Lillian presided over the celebration with the grace of a woman who has a clear view of what matters and can hold the complexity of the rest without being diminished by it. Henry and Marisol were happy in a way that was obvious and uncomplicated and right, and that was what Lillian looked at. Ruth returned from the normal school with her degree in the natural sciences, and her notebook full of 7 years of accumulation, and her settled sense of herself as a person with work to do in the world. She found a position teaching natural science at the Caldwell School, which brought her home, and she lived for 2 years in a room at the ranch before taking rooms in town, and her presence in both the school and the ranch's orbit was quietly excellent in the way that Ruth always was. She also, in 1906, met a young man named Paul Whitfield, who was a surveyor working for the county land office, which Lillian found particularly fitting given the family's history with land offices in a different register, and who was patient and precise in the manner that recommended itself to Ruth immediately. They married in 1907, the year before Henry and Marisol, and the two weddings in consecutive years made that period of the Keller family's life feel celebratory in a sustained way. Lillian and Cyrus had grandchildren by 1909, three of them, in a cascade of new arrivals that made the ranch house full at Christmas in the best possible way. James and Clara's boy, named William, was the first, followed by Ruth and Paul's daughter, and then Henry and Marisol's son. Three small people with the family's traits mixed and redistributed in interesting new combinations, examining the world with the accumulated curiosity of everyone who had come before them. In the evenings, Cyrus and Lillian sat on the porch in the way they had sat on porches since the first night he had taken her hand, and they talked about everything and nothing and watched the prairie sky do its perpetual work, which was spectacular and never identical to itself from one evening to the next. "I used to think about starting over," he said one evening, in the fall of 1910. He was 59 now, the gray fully established in his hair and the lines at his eyes deep and permanent, and he was still the same in the ways that mattered, present and patient and thoroughly himself. "When I lost the land, I thought about going somewhere entirely different. Starting fresh where nobody knew me." "What stopped you?" she asked. "I don't know entirely," he said. "Stubbornness, maybe, the kind that looks like determination from the right angle." He paused, "And then you came." "I'm glad you stayed," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day I understand more thoroughly how glad I am." She reached over and took his hand in both of hers, the way she had that first autumn evening by the stove when she had first truly seen what his history had cost him, and she held it. "You know what I think," she said. "Tell me." "I think the town that gave up on you was wrong in the most productive way possible," she said. "Because being wrong about a person leaves them free, and you were free of their story when I found you, and that's what let me see you clearly." He looked at her with that open, undefended expression that had been his gift to her for 30 years now, the one that appeared rarely and was worth everything it cost him. "And what did you see?" he said. "A man worth building a life with," she said. "I was right about that. I was completely and entirely right about that." He brought her hand up and pressed it against his face for a moment, the way he did sometimes with the things that were too large for other gestures. And the prairie evening spread around them in every direction, infinite and gold. And the Keller Ranch stood in it as a thing that had been built by two specific people from love and honesty, and the refusal to accept someone else's conclusion about who a person was or was not. The stars came out, one after another, over the Kansas plains, over the ranch and the creek, and the town that had once told itself a story about a finished man, over the pasture where the horses moved quietly in the dusk, over the houses of three grown children who carried forward something of what their parents had made, over all of it, as stars do, without commentary and without cease. Cyrus and Lillian sat together in the dark and the warmth of each other and the accumulated richness of a life built well, and they were there, present and specific and together, which was everything either of them had ever needed and more than either had once believed they would have. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world, held between two people on a porch in Kansas, in the full and ordinary and extraordinary dark.